Please introduce yourself, and you may begin.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, and Commission staff. My name is Bob Boron, and I'm here with my colleagues Alek Krstajic and Bruce Kirby. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. We each have decades of experience managing Canadian telecommunications enterprises, both with the big three wireless carriers and with competitors. But we are participating in this proceeding as private citizens. In the interest of full disclosure, we wanted to note that as a result of our previous roles as senior executives at Freedom Mobile, which we sold to Shaw in 2015, we each hold a relatively significant number of Shaw shares. However, we are not here to advocate on behalf of Shaw or any of our previous employers. In fact, our recommendations may well not be positive for Shaw or for the other MNOs. Our objective is to give the Commission our best advice on how to make a wireless regime successful in Canada in a manner that will improve the wireless market for Canadians. Alek?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you very much for allowing us to appear today and giving us some time. I'm not going to read the statement that's in front of you verbatim in the interest of efficiency. Perhaps I'll just touch on some highlights and we'll recover some of the time that we need so people can get to lunch. Look, I think it's important that we start with a little bit of our background in the context from which we're approaching this real question about how do you create sustainable competition for Canadians as a whole, and what is the current state and how likely is it to actually evolve in a way that you're going to have sustainable competition if left alone or with a light touch. I started in this industry 25, 30 years ago in wireless, selling a brick-sized cell phone that was $5,000 in the mid-'80s. I went on to Rogers and spent a decade there working for 5 different CEOs, including Ted Rogers himself, and I ended as the 2IC for John Tory running the cable company. I went over to Bell as the chief marketing officer and then the president of Bell Mobility. And what I saw during those years was not surprising. Corporations exist for a primary directive, which is to maximize profit for their shareholders. That's not a bad thing. It allows them to actually do good things with respect to philanthropy, building good networks, and improving product quality. But what we saw was the penetration levels being very, very low in terms of, we were in, I think, 30th place of the OECD countries in terms of who had wireless phones at the time. It was in, we're talking a mid-2005, 6, 7 time frame. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% penetration. Today, it's much higher. I left and with Bruce and Bob and others created Public Mobile. We raised a lot of money, and I hear a lot of the regional players that have appeared before you talk about putting money at risk. I put money that I had and some that I didn't have at risk to build Public Mobile. We saw a market evolve that even people like us that came from the incumbents, we had a healthy fear and respect of how powerful the incumbents were. We all underestimated the market power. We come to you today with what we think is a solution that will work for sure. Is it perfect? No solution ever is. But it's a solution that will, without a doubt, bring prices down and allow more Canadians to use more spectrum. The starting point for this is really what's the background and current situation in the market. And not surprisingly, you have incumbents, the big 3 MNOs coming here and telling you everything is okay. You have nothing to really do here. You folks are smart. You're going to see that we're right. We're investing in networks, and they are, and they have great networks. Now, the utilization on those networks is far below what you're going to see in other countries. So the average data usage in Canada is lower, not surprisingly, because the average price for that data usage is much higher. You can look at a lot of micro-level arguments for, is Canada vast and large, and do you have to, give them higher margins in order to be able to build networks and all this? At the end of the day, one of the gentlemen from the Manitoba panel this morning talked about EBITDA as being the proxy for how profitable the organization is. The big 3 in Canada earn EBITDA margins that are at least 10 points higher than the biggest, best-run European and American companies. Those are facts. You can find them. When I worked for Ted Rogers many years ago, he used to say, the numbers don't lie. Look at the numbers. They're earning 10 points more. Now, why is that? Is that because the folks at TELUS and Rogers and Bell, the executives running those companies, are truly superior executives that run companies more efficiently? They may tell their spouses and kids these stories, and they actually may be believed by them, but having worked with them and having been one of them, I will tell you, they're not that much better. In fact, when you look at the economies of scale that are available in the US and Europe, it actually really begs the question, how is it possible that they could have 10 points higher EBITDA margins? The answer actually resides with you, not just with you, but with Ottawa. It's that you've bought into their arguments and you've allowed them to actually continually change what's really at question here. We're here to talk about MVNOs, and should MVNOs be mandated in a way that causes Canadians to be able to get wireless service at a lower cost and therefore use more wireless service. The market is so very clearly dominated by the big three. In fact, when they talk about, they're going to cut jobs if you do this, or they're not going to invest in 5G networks, it's actually laughable. I mean, literally all you've got to do is call their bluff. And let me explain why. When they threaten that they're not going to invest in 5G, it misses the really big point here, which is, who are their competitors? Their competitors aren't Freedom Mobile and Videotron, the smaller regional players. They really aren't. Their competitors are each other. And so they're always looking to find a way to grab more customers from each other. Just look at their churn rate. If their churn rate is slightly more than 1%, which it is monthly, that means that each of those big players is losing somewhere around 15% of their subscribers annually. That is millions and millions of Rogers, Bell, and TELUS subscribers that are going somewhere else. Now, where are they going? They're not all going to Freedom and Videotron and the other regional players. If they were, their subscriber bases would be much higher. The answer to where they're going is they're shifting between Rogers, Bell, and TELUS. And when they shift between them, they're shifting because somebody's got some advantage, maybe a price. But sure as heck, it's not going to be that one of them is going to allow the other to have 5G and they won't. So they will all deploy 5G at very accelerated ways. In fact, any one of those CEOs, so whether it's Darren who sat here, whether it's Mirko, or whether it's Ed Rogers or Joe Natale, whoever comes from Rogers, any one of them who tells you that they aren't going to deploy 5G in the fastest way possible should be fired by their shareholders and their board of directors, because that would be the single biggest gaffe they could make in terms of maximizing shareholder value. This market in 2008 started to expand, and we had a fragmented new entrant market. Somebody talked earlier in the presentations about the fact that none of the new entrants had enough spectrum. They didn't have what was required to compete. But understand, some of the new players that arrived on the scene I think everybody, including us at Public Mobile, we thought, by having come from the incumbents, we had come up with a model that was going to not draw their aggression, and they weren't going to come after us. And we were going to be able to go to the sort of underserved lower end of the market with rate plans that they couldn't with their cost structure or shouldn't serve. Well, greed has an interesting way of driving strategy, and they decided they needed to basically destroy everybody. And big players came into this market. Naguib Sawiris, who owned Wind Mobile, who is a billionaire more than 10 times over, came into the market. And to put this in perspective, Wind Mobile outside of Canada was more than twice the size of Rogers, Bell, and TELUS combined. Naguib Sawiris came to this country expecting to, he saw these massive margins, and he thought, I'm just going to come to the heart of this issue and decimate these three, big, lazy incumbents. He underestimated the market power of these people. He was interviewed by one of the television networks and actually said there will be blood in the streets. Naguib's a very smart guy. He just didn't understand it was going to be his blood. And Naguib proceeded to lose billions of dollars in Canada. And so when we look at the market power of these three incumbents, and I recall talking to some American shareholders around the time that Verizon was actually looking to come into Canada. And if you recall the visceral reaction of the three MNOs, they talked about suing individuals in the government. They did everything possible to discourage Verizon from coming into Canada. Now, whether Verizon was right, whether it was right or wrong for Canadians for Verizon to come in, I'm not here to discuss. But I will tell you that they looked at what was going on in Ottawa and felt that there was no appetite here to level the playing field with the three incumbents, and decided there's other places they can invest their money. I've often had conversations with American shareholders and tried to explain to them the market power of the big three here, and said they actually dwarf Verizon and AT&T on a relative basis. Americans who often feel everything down there is bigger and therefore better say, how's that possible? How can a little Canadian telco like Rogers, Bell, or TELUS dwarf the relative power of Verizon? And I say to them, when you land at Pearson International in Toronto, in the old days, it was only Rogers who had a GSM cell phone. Now, that they're all ubiquitous, but you're roaming on one of the big three. When you get into your limo to drive downtown, the radio station that you're listening to, I would have said, was owned by Rogers, and if it's not owned by Rogers, it's now owned by Bell. The signs that you see, the big billboards on the way down, are owned by one of them. When you drive by the Rogers Centre where the Blue Jays play, or the Air Canada Centre, whatever it's called now, where the Leafs and the Raptors play, they're all owned by Rogers. The magazine in the back of the newspaper, or magazine in the back of the limo, is probably Maclean's, and it's owned by Rogers. When you check into your hotel, your TV service is delivered by one of them. So the market power that exists here with those three is truly not with equal anywhere. So if that's the situation, then the question becomes, is it a problem? I mean, should people just work harder to be able to afford the cell phone rates? And if we don't make cell phone rates affordable for everybody, then, what happens? When we launched Public Mobile in 2010, our slogan was "Everybody Talk." And the view that we had was that being able to talk, whether it's to say something good has happened or something bad has happened, and just to communicate, should be a right, not just a right to those that can afford it, but a right to everyone. And so making cell phone service affordable, I think, has some real merit. I think when you add data into the mix, I think data has another whole aspect to it. When I grew up in a poor working class family in the East End of Toronto. My parents are immigrants. The difference between a poor kid and a rich kid when I was young was essentially the poor kid had one hockey stick and had to use it for both street hockey and ice hockey, whereas the rich kid had two hockey sticks. It didn't really matter much in terms of, you could, if you were smart and you worked hard, you could get ahead. It's different today. Kids today, if they don't have access to data and the internet, they don't have access to information. They don't develop at the same rate. And so when I hear incumbents here come here and say to you, our networks are great. We have great low pricing. We don't really need to do much different. The networks are really reliable. They are reliable. I actually think the networks here are probably more reliable than I've seen in Europe and in the United States. But I think a big reason for that is because they simply aren't being utilized at the same level. And when I look at data usage in Canada, the average number of gigabytes of data usage here compared to the US, I would suggest to you that more data usage at a lower price is good for everybody. And when you look at the incremental cost, it may shave some margin down from that 45 plus EBITDA margin of the incumbents, but it's okay. And so I do take, I don't take it personally, but I'm a little bit annoyed to hear some of the arguments that are being put forward by the big three. And be clear, what what Bob said at the beginning here. We are significant by anybody's standards, shareholders of Shaw. And if you adopt even a little bit of what we are suggesting, it will cost us personally millions of dollars just immediately in terms of share price depreciation. So we're still here saying, and we struggled with this, like what's the right, what do we want to do here? We want to give you a formula, whether you follow it or not, or whether you believe it's right or not, it's up to you. But we're trying to give you a formula in terms of what you could do to fundamentally change the landscape that exists today. So how do we fix this? I'll just give you a couple of options and then stop and we can take some questions. Do MVNOs generally work? The answer to that question is more MVNOs fail than succeed. And so it begs the question, why? I believe that MVNOs, for the most part, emerge as an adjunct or an extension to an existing business. And people say, hey, we've got all these customers now. They use wireless. Why shouldn't we sell wireless? And if we can get a license, we should do it. And they invest a bunch of money in trying to expand, create a billing system. They underestimate usually the incumbent response. They underestimate the level of inertia that exists in a market to stay with stay with the existing suppliers. They underestimate the impact of people wanting a new phone because it's a status symbol and not bringing their own device and therefore being locked into a contract. The other thing that they underestimate is how hard it is to manage multiple lines of business. And if you're already in a business, and I know some of the very smart folks at Tech Savvy and firms like Comwave will disagree with me, but I can tell you when I was the chief marketing officer at Bell, we worked very hard to launch bundles. They didn't actually exist at Bell when I arrived. I was the one who started bundles at Rogers. And I will tell you that wireless is a completely unnatural bundle. So it's a natural bundle for someone to buy their telephone service, their internet service, and their television service, all from the same supplier, from the same wire, if you will, coming into the house. But then they'll almost immediately consider buying from someone else that doesn't supply those their wireless phone. TELUS had great success in Ontario where they didn't supply anything other than wireless.
I'm sorry. Can you please conclude because your time is over?
All right.
Thank you.
So we look at the different options of what you can do and say you could literally do nothing. You can leave the market as is. And not surprisingly, things probably won't change much. You can do what the Competition Bureau says and allow the fourth wireless player to proceed on their own, and you'll see some movement. You can open the floodgates completely to MVNOs. And if you do, I think you're going to see a lot of people fail because it's a lot harder to do than you might otherwise realize. The other thing to understand in that particular point is the incumbents have market power to be able to make some of the newer players that are trying to launch wireless on the backs of other internet or television services or telephone services suffer in their core business and therefore control them that way. The other option, and the one that we're proposing to you, is that you choose one national MVNO. You appoint that MVNO, you enable that MVNO with a transfer price that allows them to compete and allows them to deliver service so that they will earn nothing more than the 35% EBITDA margin that's available in the rest of the world and be able to do it for Canadians at a price that's competitive. I'll conclude there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner MacDonald.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your presentation today. I think that's where I'd like to start with some questions. The challenge will be now I need to actually read my own writing because I've been taking notes as you've been speaking. And I think I want to start off with one of your last points because it's not something that we've heard, and it's around the fact that wireless is not a natural bundle with phone, internet, and TV services. And I confess I hadn't turned my mind to that in the past. And I'm wondering, can you expand on that a little bit? Is it just because people buy companies provision phone, internet, and TV over a single cable going into the house, or is it more fundamental than that?
I think it's partly what you've just described. It's that it's coming across it's also one decision maker in the home. So you'll have the person, in the case of a family, you'll have the person making those buying decisions by those things. They don't necessarily translate to a teenager who's paying their own cell phone bill who may buy from a brand like Virgin Mobile versus a brand like Bell. And so they make their own buying decisions. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is you'll often see the incumbents marketing in very, very different ways. It was brought up this morning that there will be some substitution. If you can get the price of wireless data usage down to really competitive levels, then people won't need their home connection quite as much. And so while they want bundles, they will always try to maintain the margins in each of the businesses on their own.
I liked your comment about teenagers paying for their own phone. That's not been my experience.
To be clear, it's not mine either.
Okay. Does any of that tie to the fact that people may add wireless services one at a time as children reach a certain age, or contract periods come to an end, whereas on the wireline side, everything tends to be up for negotiation at the same time?
I think that has a big part to play as well.
Okay, thank you. With respect to your suggestion of mandating MVNO access, but that it being just one provider that's selected, why is that beneficial to do as opposed to mandating multiple different potential MVNOs across the country?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Number one, having a single player with a single strategy and a single objective that's completely aligned with what you want is easy to manage. Having multiple players in a more fragmented market causes a lot of, at times, irrationality. I can tell you from experience that had there been only one new entrant back in 2008 with all the spectrum that was available as a set-aside and had been just made available in a beauty contest, if you will, with a certain price, I think we'd be much further ahead in terms of competition today. I think by the fact that you had, at that time in Ontario, 3 new entrants, Public Mobile, Wind, and Mobilicity, one of them, as soon as they didn't get traction, it didn't have the experience in terms of how to manage, literally dropped prices to levels that were uneconomic. So if what you're after is short-term massive price drops, yeah, open the floodgates. If what you're after is a long-term sustainable solution and sustainable low prices, then they have to be done in a way that's measured. When Mobilicity, I remember trying to sit down with the folks from Mobilicity when they came up with rate plans and I said to them, look, there's no contribution margin at the levels you're selling at. Like, what are you doing? And when their leader says to me, I'm going to make it up in volume, I sit and I go, okay, well, this is going to bring everybody down. And it did. And those types of moves caused massive capital erosion in terms of the investments that were made. And so I think one makes sense because and by the way, I would, it's a walk before you run strategy. Appoint one that aligns with the objectives you've got. If it's not enough, you can add a second one. But opening the floodgates and then going back, I think creates a bigger headache for you.
And on the topic of selecting that one, and we'll get back to the beauty contest and what that could look like in a few minutes. But do you envision that one being one of the newer entrants that have come into the market, one of the newer facilities-based providers? Do you view it as being a net new logo, or you have no preference one way or another?
I'm torn in terms of answering that because I think that there has to be some consideration given to the fourth wireless players in these markets, or before us when T-Bay was speaking, I think people have made massive capital investments in a strategy that was deployed here in Ottawa that said we're going to have facilities-based players. And so I think those facilities-based players do require some consideration, maybe along the lines of what the Competition Bureau was saying, although we need to study that a little bit more, and would be happy to get back to you on that. No, to use your expression, it's one net new logo. I think that you need to have a pure wireless play that is not constrained by other lines of business. If you look at the success that, whether it's facilities-based or an MVNO, you look at the United States and you see how well T-Mobile has done as a facilities-based player, or TracFone as an MVNO. They're pure plays. They're not distracted by, well, let's leverage wireless to help our internet sales, or let's not poke the bear with internet sales because they might, or let's not poke them with wireless because internet sales might suffer because the big guy might crush us. A pure play, a single one, makes a lot of sense to me.
And if it is just one, knowing that this company would have to get up and running and turn a profit as quickly as they're able to, don't you think that the motivation would be just to go and launch in the larger centers, at least at the initial stages, versus bringing more competition to Montreal or the GTA or Calgary as an example? And that's great for the people living in those particular urban centers, but not so much for the rest of the country.
I didn't come today prepared to talk about how I think it should roll out, but I think that your question is fair. I think that, first of all, if you ran a process to try to figure out which plan was the best plan, one, it needs to take into account that it's going to launch everywhere. Two, quite frankly, done right, they should announce what the rate plan is going to be, and it should be a ubiquitous rate plan nationally. I've watched areas where there was actually, like, some of the lowest prices existed in Manitoba when Manitoba Tel was around. All of a sudden what happens is, and look, with all due respect to the folks here in Ottawa that made that decision, you let Bell take out Manitoba Tel, they funneled off some assets to Xplornet, and the prices went up. And so I look at it and say, I think that for the folks that were ahead of us from T-Bay, if they're going to launch a rate plan that's going to be the exact same rate plan that this national MVNO would launch, well, then the national MVNO doesn't need to be there because someone's actually already doing that. But I think the national MVNO needs to make a commitment to launch everywhere. By the way, some of the folks that are here, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned folks that are ambitious that think they can become an MVNO. The costs we're talking about to really launch a service, they're still quite extensive, even if you don't have a network. When I was the chief marketing officer of Bell, now granted that was a few years ago, the cost for me to blanket the country to launch a new service was $52 million for 1 year. So at the very least, you're going to spend $52 million plus your billing plus everything else. So there has to be, whoever comes forward needs to say, look, I have $100 million at least to start getting this thing going. But yeah, I think it has to be a plan that's going to not just try to exploit the highest density population centers like Toronto and Montreal. It has to go everywhere.
Okay, thanks for that. With respect to a lot of the comments that we've heard, especially from the existing providers, around the fact that one of the consequences of mandating MVNO access will be reduced investment. Based on your submission today, I think you believe that some of those statements are not credible. You said they'll still deploy 5G. Those investments won't dry up. But if the risk profile for wireless investments change and the cost of borrowing does go up, doesn't that mean that either investments will be reduced, at least by some degree, or customers will end up paying more at the end of the day for those services?
I mean, the simple answer is no. I mean, they all talked to you last week about how, if you do anything that does this, we're going to cut back investment, cut back charitable giving for some reason. But the actual drivers behind what they invest isn't that. I mean, like Mirko Bibic from Bell sat here and said that every year he has to go out and get the privilege to invest the $4 billion in capex, and talked about the shareholders or investors who enable him to do that. Well, shareholders and investors don't enable them to do that. The customers in Canada enable them to do that. That investment, including all of the operating expenses and everything else they do, is paid for by Canadian customers, with plenty of money these days left over that is used to pay dividends out to their shareholders. The shareholders are always receiving money back. They're not actually investing in Canadian networks and Canadian operations. And so the answer is, if those excessive profits they're able to generate today due to the oligopoly position they operate in shrink somewhat, they'll still be able to make all those investments. And so the question becomes is, will they choose not to do so for some other reason? Now, they could say, well, as we made a threat and we're going to live up to that if you actually make this decision. So we're going to cut back on the investment that we put into our networks, and we're going to slow down the deployment of 5G. Well, that only works if, in fact, everybody does that at the same time. In other words, if they have exactly the ability to collude and market power they constantly come here to tell you they don't have. Because if Bell and Telus live up to their demands that they're going to cut back on investment, and Rogers decides to go ahead with 5G, Rogers then will create a substantial differentiation in the market through its networks. And by doing so, will gain market share and will be much more successful than the other two, which will then force them, of course, to respond and compete. What actually happens in the market today is they actually compete a fair amount on deploying networks and deploying services. What they do by competing on those types of features, what they avoid is competing on price. And so they all match each other on price and then try to sort of be a little more differentiated in terms of some of the deployments they do and how quickly they roll out the networks. And they've always competed in the Canadian market around the investments. And even if all three of them decide to collude and scale back their investments, you actually have these fourth regional players who are continuing to invest and continuing to grow. And that gives them even more of an incentive to invest, because now they're going to gain and reduce the differential they currently have with the big three players, and will be more successful by doing so. So the only way this threat actually really works for them is if they can somehow get all of the existing operators to, at the exact same time, agree to scale back their investments and to do so in a manner that requires the collusion that they claim is impossible.
Okay, but just to stay on that topic for a second, if the cost to borrow do increase, and I'm not suggesting it would be $1 billion cut, but the options would be, at least off the top of my head, delay or cut back on investment to a certain degree, raise prices, or at least not implement planned pricing reductions, or cut the dividend. And I'm sure a great many people would question the willingness of any of these providers to actually cut their dividend. So what other area can the efficiencies be found?
First of all, the cost of borrowing for any of these big players is literally looking at what the prevailing Bank of Canada rate is and what the markets will give them. The other comment that was made by some of the incumbents was that if you all did this, that investors would go to other markets and invest in other telcos that don't have this onerous MVNO policy. And I would just say, so investors are going to go and take money from 45% EBITDA margin companies to 35% EBITDA margin companies. It doesn't make any sense. With respect to your exact point, I guess I look and I say the trade-offs will always be made in a way that says we will have a network, first and foremost, that is going to be able to serve all the potential uses that our customers have, both our current and any of the customers we're trying to get. On the point of planned price reductions, I don't think in all my years at incumbents there was never a planned price reduction in a business plan. And so I think that if they're telling you they have planned price reductions, you should ask for a schedule. So I think that one's way off. So I actually think that if they had a choice, and let's take the last one you brought up, you could cut the dividend or you could cut your 5G deployment. the cutting the dividend might have a short-term impact on your stock price, and so we really work hard never to do that. But cutting your 5G deployment is cutting off your future, and so that's out of the two, they'll cut the dividend first.
So that's kind of a good segue to my next question, because if we assume that, okay, there's not going to be wide-scale reductions in investment in networks and deployment. Yes, 5G is going to be deployed. Again, I think that's a given in regions of the country where the population is more dense. That may not necessarily, there will always be a business case to build in downtown Montreal. There may not always be a business case to build on Miscou Island in northern New Brunswick, as an example. So if there are any reductions or delays to 5G deployment, just to stay on the same theme, isn't it more likely that those delays will happen in the very rural and remote areas that collectively we're working so hard to bring online?
I think that's correct, but I think that happens anyway. I think whenever you're deploying, they're not starting in the least dense areas. They're going to leave those to last because the payback is longer there. That's the reality. And if they're telling you that they're going to build 5G in those areas first, I don't think that's accurate. And so, yes, a reduction in margin may have an impact on the rate of deployment in some areas. But again, I would suggest to you, the good folks from T-Bay-Tel this morning were saying, if you're going to mandate this, then they wanted the MVNOs to have to deal with them or the regional players. I think what will happen, it's a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma, which is what keeps it sort of self-policing and honest. Somebody will deploy in those areas, and the MVNO will go to the party that has the 5G network. If you don't deploy in a remote area and it's all 4G and one person does 5G, all the customers will gravitate to that customer, to that supplier. So I can't solve for your problem that the remote areas don't take priority, but I don't think it's accurate to say that they just won't get served.
What about being served by regional carriers? Because one of the things we've heard time and time again are that MVNOs will, by and large, cause the most harm to the regional carriers that are just now starting to gather steam. And with more competitors in the market, those same regional providers may be less apt to go to regions where the business case for them is already a little bit suspect, because they will no longer be able to assume that they'll get a particular market share that perhaps they've been used to in the past. Would you care to comment on that concern?
I think it's a fair concern, but I think the question that we all have to answer is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And if we try to be everything to everybody, we just won't get there. And that's a little bit of the shell game that goes on with some of these arguments. If what we're here to do is to figure out how to bring pricing down to levels that are at sort of world competitive levels on a sustainable basis, then the reality is there's something has to give. So some of those regional players might have had expansion plans, and it won't make sense anymore because an MVNO can go in. But look, I was trained as an economist. If it's about, maximizing the marginal utility and maximizing the overall interest for everybody, then the reality is that something is going to have to give. And so if some of those regional players don't expand, that may be okay.
Okay, thank you. The last time we really looked at this was 5 years ago, and the strength of the regional players at that time, their proportion of the market share was less than it is today. We can have a debate as to whether they've been able to get as many customers as perhaps they could have or that the Commission was expecting. But given all of the complexities with gaining access to spectrum, building a facilities-based network, potentially from scratch, starting with a customer base of 0 and perhaps an unknown brand, should we at all be surprised that they're still hovering around the 10% mark after these years in the market? I'm just wondering, if it appears to be working, albeit perhaps too slowly, is now not the time to meddle?
It's a fair question. And I don't think I have a definitive answer for you, but what I would say to you is this. You have to ask yourself, did they get 10% on their own, or did the big three realize they've got to let them have, and they took the 10% that was the lowest marginal utility customers? And what suggests to you that the next 10%, because that's the low-hanging fruit. So why do you believe they're going to be more successful in the next 5 years? Is it critical mass? Is it that the incumbents are going to all of a sudden realize, geez, we should play nice? I mean, look, Chatter was launched in 2010, just as Wind, Mobilicity, and Public launched. They had a massive advertising campaign that didn't talk about the product, or the price, or any of their service. All it was designed to do was attack the new entrants about having bad networks. So much so that the Competition Bureau levied, I think at the time, the highest fine ever levied on a Canadian corporation for false and misleading advertising. And so the way these guys play the game is really tough. Telecom in Canada is a blood sport, and they're all going to do whatever it takes to protect the golden goose of 45% plus EBITDA margins. So am I surprised that it's only 10%? No, I'm not. My question is, what makes you think that they're going to get to 20% ever?
Well, and I guess my thought is some of that comes back to the time to deploy and the time to get a certain level of credibility in the market. In previous conversations last week, we were talking about dropped calls when a provider leaves one network, perhaps a regional carrier, and goes out of their range. That impacts customers. It takes time to physically build out your network. It takes time to build your brand and for customers to understand, okay, you know what, when I pick up my phone, it's actually going to work on this new service provider. Given the amount of time and the complexity involved, I just don't know whether it would have been reasonable to assume that as these companies started, they would have been able to reach more than 10%. I know the big guys are always going to play hardball. I'm just not sure, and you were a new entrant. In the modeling you did, are you surprised by the length of time it's taken to reach 10%? And is your view at all colored by perhaps their more recent success in adding new subscribers at a higher rate in the last couple of years than perhaps they might have in their initial couple of years in the market? There might be like 6 questions in there. I apologize.
Look, I think they've done a wonderful job, and I'm smiling because, I mean, Paul McAleese, who's running Freedom Mobile for Shaw, is a brilliant marketer. I knew him in my days at Rogers, and I was the guy that brought him in when I was leaving. I think he's done an amazing job. I think that it takes a lot of really smart people working really hard to do what they've done and what the good folks at Videotron and other similar players have done. So I think that the original business plans, if you took Public Mobile, Mobilicity, and Wind in 2010, 10 years ago, they probably all said to their investors they were going to get to 10% market share within 5 years, and that seemed really reasonable. Now, the aggregate of all of them is getting to 10% 10 years later. So I'm I think I was naive in 2010 to believe that we would have been able to get 10% in 5 years. So I'm not surprised now that I see how the market has evolved, that it's only at 10%. But again, my concern is the next 10. Look, this is a very difficult question. Do you license one MVNO, many MVNOs? I think that, or do you not license any new ones and just do what the Competition Bureau is suggesting and take the facilities-based regional fourth players who are doing a good job and give them a leg up? There may be an option to actually have a hybrid of the two. And be clear, if what you do is say, we're going to give the fourth regional players another 5-year run, but we're going to ensure they become more successful because they've invested the capital. And what we're going to do is make them essentially an MVNO, and they can plug into the national networks and compete across the board. As a shareholder of Shaw, I'm very happy. Is that the right plan? And does it ensure the competitive landscape that I think you want? Not as well as having that new MVNO that makes everything self-policing, because any of these incumbents that are, they're still, like Shaw is still an incumbent, they still have to worry about their internet business, their landline cable business. They still have to worry about these things. They're not a pure play. That's why we are so convinced that if what you have one objective, and that one objective is to, as quickly as possible, change the competitive landscape so that Canadians get more usage at a lower price, then you need to put someone, you need that net new logo you described.
Thank you for that. Just to switch gears, because we've talked a lot about the innovation that MVNOs can bring to the market. I think that's a term you actually used in one of your submissions as well. Beyond price, what innovation do MVNOs bring to the market that isn't there already between the primary brands, the new the new entrants, and the flanker brands?
I think innovation can take a variety of different forms, from the way the product is taken to market in terms of both, the 4 P's of marketing, price, promotion, positioning, et cetera. I think the other way is distribution. We are so locked into a bricks and mortar approach to selling these services, and the stores are big and beautiful, and that may be required. I don't think that, I think the MVNO, if an MVNO emerged that was going to be really successful, it would go to the underserved areas first and foremost. So that's still, I believe, the lower end of the market, the customers that are more price sensitive. We did some studies of our own years ago when we launched public mobile in terms of what's the elasticity of demand at different price ranges for service. And I think that you can get innovation in terms of how some of those packages come to market.
Okay, thank you. Let's jump to the beauty contest, as you described it, for selecting this new national MVNO. Your submission this morning mentioned 3 basic criteria: market experience, sufficient capital, and a viable plan. Those all seem very logical. Are there other characteristics that we should take into account when weighing what could potentially be a fairly large number of applicants to become that new national MVNO?
I'll start, but I'll toss this to Bob and Bruce as well. I don't know. I mean, those are the 3 obvious ones. I think that it's a bit like how long is a piece of string. It could be anything. There could be, I think you'll have as many innovative approaches to this question as you'll have applicants. And I think there could be some applicants that come forward and have a real strategic niche in terms of how they're going to approach the market. And it might be something that resonates with you, and you realize, wow, that really stands out compared to just a bunch of folks who have money and have done this before, there could be something really interesting from a strategic perspective. I don't know, Bruce and Bob, if you guys think there's anything else.
I don't really have much that can add to that, because I mean, the answer is you want to have a broad opportunity to make that what we described as a viable plan that can be in innovative ways that addresses your previous question about how you go and serve the market in a new and different way. And then you need to, at the end of the day, make a judgment around which of those is the most likely and the most effective to achieve the public policy objective.
Is there any concern in your mind that such a scenario would just amount to the CRTC picking winners and losers in that process?
Well, hopefully you're going to pick a winner. Look, I think that I've heard that question from folks at industry, from folks here. At the end of the day, it's your job. I mean, you're supposed to come up with a solution to solve this problem for Canadians. And what you have to do is pick a winner. So yeah, I think, look, coming up with a policy in a vacuum isn't something you would ever do. That's why you're having these hearings. That's why you have interventions. But then there's this whole other thing that a beauty contest could actually do for you, which is to actually show you what's out there in terms of creative thinking. And yeah, you'd have to pick a winner. I think that's actually okay.
So at one end of the spectrum, we have your suggestion, which is one national MVNO. At the other end of the spectrum, it's, we'll blow the doors off and open it up to however many providers actually want to come in. And let market forces decide which ones are successful and which ones are not. You yourself noted that most MVNOs actually end up failing. Can you unpack for me a little bit, if we did mandate a large number of MVNOs and a significant number of them failed, what does that mean for the end customer? The good, the bad, and the ugly about the large three providers are right now. No one needs to worry about their cell phone not working tomorrow because the provider has gone bankrupt. That may not be the case if there's a large number of MVNOs out there.
I think there's a disruptive thing that takes place for customers. I don't know how some of these MVNOs will go to market. Some may be brilliant marketers and decide they're going to go to market, and the one hook is you get this great rate plan, but you've got to buy your device, and the device may or may not be something that other carriers will take or use. So there you could have a situation where customers are laying out cash to get this deal, and then it's not sustainable. I think you're going to get a lot, if you open the floodgates, I think you're going to get a lot of people. There'll be chaos in the market. There will be a lot of noise. It'll be difficult for any one to actually emerge with their message, because I think there will be, as I say, a lot of noise. I think that there will be a lot of capital lost. There was a lot of capital lost after 2008 with all this money that was spent on spectrum and then all the money on marketing and building networks, and it was wasted.
Thank you. Just a couple of last questions. First one's with respect to rate setting. You've suggested a retail minus approach. Others have suggested following, phase two costing. We all know that can be a time-consuming and very complex process. Can you outline what the benefits would be to a retail minus approach? Because even that may not be all that simple, given the sheer number of plans that are available out there right now, especially if there's any suggestion that we should look at plans that are available in other markets outside Canada to set that rate.
I'll start, but these two guys are way smarter than me, so I'm going to get them to weigh in. Look, whatever mechanism you use, you have to understand that the incumbents are very smart, and they come here and they find ways to cloud the issue. So whatever mechanism you use needs to take into account that they are really intelligent and they're finding ways to go around it. The retail minus approach I like personally, because it's depending on where you peg it, if it's their lowest retail rate available anywhere. First of all, I don't believe that we should have regional differences in rates. People in Manitoba or Toronto or Montreal or BC, anywhere, should all be paying the same rate if it's from the same supplier. I don't think there should be regional differences in rates. So the retail minus keeps everybody honest. It says, okay, don't try to exert your market power in different ways in different markets. We're going to take your lowest available rate in the market, and it becomes a retail minus from that. That's why I like retail minus. But Bruce, over to you if there's more, and Bob.
Yeah, I think that's the key point. And by lowest retail rate, I mean the actual lowest rate they offer to a customer, not necessarily what they list in their rate plans, because they often offer rates that are substantially below those as ways to win back customers and so on. And that becomes a policing effect, because to the extent they decide to drop their prices to try to engage in predatory pricing, they effectively lower the wholesale rate that applies to that when they do that, make that reduction. And as you said before, the alternative is these costing studies, which always sound great in theory, but becomes a and we went through it with the rate for roaming. It was a multi-year process. I mean, Commission spends an enormous amount of time working on it. There's a lot of game playing by the incumbents. Nobody other than the incumbents gets to see enough of the data to actually challenge any of their assumptions around what these economic costs are, other than directly within the Commission itself has to spend a lot of time on that. And then it becomes a thing that becomes fixed, and you've got to go through an entire process again to try and revise that in what can be a fairly dynamic market. And so if you just make it like a reduction off of what they're charging, if they're prepared to sell a certain amount of data to a customer at a certain price, then clearly that's above their cost, unless they're selling it below cost, which is its own separate issues. But and if that's the case, then if you just set the rate below that, you create room for someone to come in and compete with these guys, and it becomes, as Alek said, a self-policing effect, because any attempt to sort of go after them on price is one that forces them to then reduce their own prices they're offering on that wholesale service.
Okay, so just one quick follow-up to that, maybe two. Would the retail minus approach just be looking at what's available, what's being offered in the Canadian market, or would we also look to other jurisdictions internationally in setting that rate? Or trying to decide, I'm thinking in the context of deciding what the markdown should be.
You've just added another layer, which I think is a very good question, but I think that the retail minus works in terms of the Canadian market, but I love where you're thinking, because you're already now saying, okay, but then they could just raise all their retail rates. So there has to be some objective, I think, that is set here that says this is sort of the average world price. This is what we are sort of looking to try to get to. The MVNO has a goal to get you there. The MVNO, look, if you're lucky enough to become this single MVNO, if this plan ever came to be, you can't also allow the MVNO to make extraordinary profits, right? It's got to be done in a way that says you've got to keep dropping your price to the point where you're bringing Canadians down to where the world levels are. So there's a second layer that we could take an undertaking to come back to you and think that through, but there's a second part I can't think of quickly enough.
Yeah, if you want to take that offline, that would be very appreciated. I guess to add an extra layer of complexity, you had said not just the best available posted price, but also what they offer to their customers, assuming if the customer's in some type of negotiation and the service provider is trying to maintain that customer on their network. How would we then factor in what's become very common, the gift of some type of gift with purchase? You sign up for this package and, we'll throw in a smart TV because we're such good guys. How do we take that into account in the retail minus approach?
Another very good question. I think what happens is what you will see is the incumbents probably start to do a version of gift with purchase that involves the other services that a wireless customer they have in a bundle. They're going to find ways to lock that customer up. I don't know that you should worry about that. I think the gift with purchase that's a big screen TV is a marketing expense, and I wouldn't waste much time on that because the MVNO should just be able to compete against that as a marketing expense. And if they have to match the TV, they'll match the TV. I wouldn't be as worried about that.
Okay, thank you. And just one final question before I turn you over to my colleagues. You didn't read your opening statement, but I did. So I'm going to read part of it back to you. That, again, with respect to negotiations and rate setting, must not in any way rely on negotiations with the big three. It is impossible to have reasonable commercial negotiations with a party that by definition sees no benefit whatsoever in the completion of a negotiation. I think that's an interesting statement, but we have discussed commercial negotiations a great deal. What do you get from the retail minus approach that couldn't also be accomplished by a commercial negotiation so long as there was a CRTC backstop to finalize a given rate in the event of a dispute?
So in the early days of public mobile, we had this experience. The original mandatory roaming requirements was for a commercial negotiation. And so we went and sat down with the major carriers and had a commercial negotiation. At the first meeting, you discuss what your objectives are, and they explained their objective was to not come to a deal, other than at the price that they wanted to set it at, which was absurdly high, about $1,000 a gigabyte for data. And that's because that was the incentive. I mean, worst case is they would drag it out through a negotiation, then force you to go through a complicated arbitration process. And, you know, worst case was you've got a reasonable rate as opposed to an unreasonable rate, and it would take you 6 months or a year to get through all that process. If you say, well, here's a negotiation with the CRTC backstop as sort of as a backstop, it's one better than a more commercial arbitration approach. It's much better because you have experts who understand the issues. But you're effectively just forcing the issue into the backstop because the approach of the incumbents will always be to direct, because the longer they can delay anything that happens in terms of bringing in new competition, it's a success for them. And so they have every incentive to drag out the process as long as they can, to force into a backstop, to drive a process that hopefully they can, you know, game in some fashion that actually comes out with a number that they see as effective to them, and effective by being it's not a sustainable competitor that they're facing. But that's the result. You're never going to get to a solution with a party where one of the parties has no incentive whatsoever to come to a reasonable conclusion.
And if I can just add, sitting here less than a week ago in this hearing room, the CEO of Bell Canada, when asked the question by, it might have been yourself, Commissioner, I'm not sure, about what his appetite was to sit down and negotiate with an MVNO with respect to price or the provision of services, he gave a flat no, that if the MVNO wanted to provide broadly based services to Canadians, he had no appetite to sit down with them. So as Bruce said, I think you know, putting that mechanism in place is simply just putting a time plug in that's going to further delay getting to something that makes sense for the MVNO if there's a CRTC backstop.
I think there was also, I mean, we watched some of the hearings, the question asked about how many parties have they negotiated with for MVNOs, and I think the answer was 15 that they've been negotiating with. I can't remember which commissioner was asking the questions. Yes, and then the follow-up question, which I thought was great, which was how many of the 15 have you negotiated a deal with? And the answer was a big 0. There's no surprise. I mean, look, I'm probably going to lose a few more friends as a result of being here today that work at Rogers, Bell and Telus, if I still have any. But I remember when we launched Public Mobile, and we thought, in good faith, we thought, look, we're going after a different market. We're not going to sell BlackBerries. We're not after the big data customers. We're going to the market you don't want to serve. I know you don't want to serve it because I worked with you guys. And so tower sharing was one of the things that was supposed to be done with commercial negotiations. And it's a big joke. We would come to them and we'd say, here are the towers we'd like to get on. They'd take the maximum number of days. They'd come back and they'd say, oh, Alek, here's a problem with that tower. First of all, you can't expect to go ahead of our future plans. And there's this thing, 5G, in about 10 years, so we're going to need space for that. And so then they get you way down the tower where the tower is no longer feasible for a radio antenna. And then they add one last piece, which is, and the extra weight of your equipment now requires a full re-engineering. So that's another $250,000. I mean, they make this thing, it's a game to them in some ways. And in other ways, look, I have to also show some respect. They are really good at what they do. That's why there's no MVNOs in Canada. That's why there's no tower sharing. Look, this is the last jurisdiction where they haven't farmed out their towers. Towers are trading at multiples that it makes really good sense for their shareholders to divest themselves of towers. The reason they don't, it would open up competition potentially. So it's another lever where they say facilities-based players won't be able to go to these towers because we control them. In the same way, commercial negotiations with a backstop, you're just buying yourself a headache. You're going to be arbitrating everything.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation throughout this process and your comments today. Each of you bring a different perspective than perhaps we've heard from other parties, so it is appreciated. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe just one final question following on Commissioner McDonald's discussion with you. How long do you think, you talked about lengthy processes, how long do you think it would take us to get to your recommended conclusion?
I have a habit of making things seem easier than they are, so I apologize in advance if that comes across here.
Well, you can assume it'll take us several months to render a decision on this matter.
Okay.
And then you propose,
so we haven't convinced
and then you
that.
propose another process.
No, I think
where
you
we
can,
would.
Sir, I think it can. Look, I think you're going to take a few months to figure this out. I think on the heels of that, and maybe as part of that, you could ask all the parties that if you were going to license one or multiple MVNOs, some detailed analysis on what that transfer price should be. So I think you can do that in parallel. If you decide to then have an MVNO, that work has already been done, and you can start to do that in parallel in terms of the analysis. I think if you decide to go the route that we're suggesting and try to run a beauty contest to choose one, I think you have calls for applications on how this would all transpire, and you could do that in parallel as well. You could say that over the next 90 days, all interested applicants would put something forward, and that might actually have an impact on your deliberations, because you may look at some of these applicants and go, hadn't thought of that, that's a really good idea. So look, if it were me, I'd probably say, you know, I have this expression, there's always a way. So run your process, but it doesn't have to be done in series, it can be done in parallel. Run 3 processes in parallel. The one you've got going right now, ask for applicants, and ask for submissions on what the transfer price should be.
Thank you. Council, any questions? Then I thank you very much, as did Commissioner McDonald, for taking the time to share your views with us. They're very informative. We'll take a break, returning at 2:15.